Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning if you're in the Pacific time zone. It's my pleasure to talk with all of you, and I'm really happy that there are so many of you that have joined this webinar, and also am delighted to represent this really awesome team of people: Terry Powell, Alain Chakran-Garneau, Will Becker, and Brian Garner. There's only one Will Becker here, not two Will Beckers, so I think that must be a typo. But we're here, and each of the presenters will share about their work in developing what we hope are really practical, useful implementation science products that you can actually use and not be bewildered by theories, models, and frameworks coming out of the world of implementation science. So, in case you don't know, it's really a major challenge to get research to practice, to translate, even though we all will say this in our grant applications. We really want significance and innovation. We really want to demonstrate public health impact. It's a real challenge. So this is a really interesting pipeline concept developed by Green et al. And produced in this graphic form by our colleague Margot Heron, who I think is on the call. But essentially, the rubric is that it takes 17 years to get proven innovations to patients and providers. And there are a number of reasons for this. There are a number of leaks in the pipeline. So let's take a look at the first one. Sometimes the things that we want to translate are too complex and challenging for people to implement in routine settings. The second leak is often the fit, that for whatever reason, it's not an easy fit. And that could be a number of reasons. It doesn't fit within the context of the organization. It doesn't fit within the workflow. It doesn't fit within the belief system of the people who are delivering the services. And then lastly, and not inconsequentially, is the cost. So three major reasons that contribute to a lot of wasted innovation. So what it means in the bottom line is that about 14% of these proven innovations reach the final end of the pipeline. So a relative 14% success. So the science of implementation is really trying to bridge what we know and what we do and kind of overcome those kind of pitfalls, those barriers at the level of complexity, fit, and cost. And there are many barriers, and these are really an effort to summarize many of them into three big buckets. But what essentially implementation science is a bridge. Implementation science is a bridge between what we know and what we do, and involves systematic, precise methods for analyzing different things that could get in the way of a successful implementation or translation, strategies that we might use to target those kind of barriers or things that get in the way, or even accentuate assets, things that are supportive of our translation. And then finally, measure outcome, really measure the impact and not just fingers crossed, hope for the best. It's about doing the right thing, but it's also about making sure that we're measuring the outcome. So you're going to hear a lot more about those three concepts, the kind of things that could make or break an implementation, the kind of strategies that we use to successfully implement and sustain an intervention, and then lastly, how you measure. And across all of that, you'll hear from Dr. Powell about how to engage your end users from start throughout and through the end process. So you'll hear a lot more detail as we go today. So this is a figure that was first reported in a paper by Cheng et al. In the Journal of Drug and Alcohol Dependence that talked about typically the kind of research we do is effectiveness research, where we have unproven interventions, we evaluate them, we see how they result in patient-level outcomes, often symptom severity and functioning. A more common approach over the past few years is looking at implementation preparation. So what are the kind of things that it might take to deliver that intervention, or what are the kind of things that might get in the way of our delivering that intervention, or even the patient's experience of the intervention. So people will often do qualitative work looking at barriers and facilitators. So often specific aim 3 of a project, and sometimes get a feel for implementation outcomes by asking people about the acceptability, the feasibility, the appropriateness of the intervention in their experience, whether it's from a patient perspective or a provider perspective. And then lastly, kind of the current zeitgeist is really focused on opening that final black box, really thinking like Russian dolls, like successive boxes or dolls within larger and smaller containers. And the current focus of implementation science methods is really about opening that black box of implementation strategies, the kind of things that are done to ultimately implement the innovation, and how to select those strategies, what exactly they are, how they work, are they being used with fidelity, what's the degree of participation in them, and how much they cost. So one of the things that we also come across is that there are some common myths about implementation. Uh, I think here some people talk about implementing a new or adapted intervention and evaluating it as implementation science. That's false. Developing an evidence-based intervention in a new way is an implementation science endeavor. That's false. If you're an intervention developer or a trialist, someone else should worry about translation or to routine care settings. That's false as well. And qualitative methods to typically key informant interviews for barriers and facilitators are enough of implementation science in most research projects, and we'd like to think that's false as well. So one of the things that we've come across is that as implementation scientists, we're frequently, much like a biostatistician, kind of brought to the research team table at some point in the game, maybe some point in the application process, the application development process, sometimes in the revised application process, and sometimes after the grant is funded. And oftentimes people will send us specific aims pages and say, could you take a look at this and help us understand how we can make our work with a little bit more of an implementation science lens, or increase the chances of the implementability of the thing that we're trying to study and evaluate. And I want to credit the HD2A center grant that we have, the Research Adoption Support Center, and also the NIDA P50 Center of Excellence, the CDS, the Center for Dissemination and Implementation at Stanford, both of whom both centers have actually played a role in the development of all the things you're going to be hearing about today. So in terms of developing a tool that would help investigators understand if they're optimizing implementation methods and approaches, there's a team of people who help contribute to the development of this tool. Some of them are actually on this presentation today, Will and Alen, but also colleagues Heather Gotham here at Stanford, Hendrix Brown at Northwestern, and Sarah Becker at Northwestern. And actually, many other people have played a significant role in the development of this tool. So I think, and I continue to hear that what implementation science offers is really a complicated set of things. And I credit NIDA program official, Dr. Lori Ducharme, with this kind of analogy, metaphor, that what we seem to present to people are the kind of 1,000 or 10,000 piece Lego kits of theories, models, and frameworks, and say, kind of have at it and kind of make sense of that. And it's kind of ironic in that people focused on implementation and translation are doing things that are anything but organized in that direction. So this is what the field appears to offer, and the next slide shows what the field appears to need. So this is the Duplo set for those of you that have had small children, or at least know about what Duplos are, and not to make things too simple that they're no longer relevant, too reductionistic, but we really think that there's a role or a purpose around pragmatism and really developing things and translating things into ways that people who aren't implementation scientists can actually use. And that's really the point of this whole presentation. You'll hear about 4 tools, measures, and guides that we think are kind of in the Duplo direction, if you will. So I think I don't want to be redundant, but I think this is what we hear researchers want. They want to increase the chances that their good work, their outstanding innovations, their interventions are translated so that people actually benefit from them. They really want to understand what are the barriers to the implementability of their interventions. They want to do more than these qualitative interviews, even though that's a kind of a checking of the box. And like I've been saying, they want more from people like me and our colleagues to really do something that's practical and meaningful and not just a tower of babble of language and theories, models, and frameworks. So we organized really the complexity of D&I science or implementation science into five major buckets, if you will. So there's the issue of the evidence for the intervention, and to the degree to which there's little evidence for the intervention, you'll be working towards establishing a signal of efficacy or the promise of efficacy, efficacy and effectiveness, and so forth. But if the evidence is strong for an intervention, you're really focused on how to translate it, how to implement it, how to get it out there so that more people deliver it and more patients or consumers receive it. So to some extent, the evidence for the intervention or the criteria and the strength of evidence will determine how much of your project can focus on implementation. And you might consider hybrid designs as one way of thinking about that versus traditional efficacy, effectiveness, and even comparative implementation trials, kind of on the other end of a hybrid type 3. Partner engagement, how to bring people into the conversation early and often. And Dr. Powell will be talking about that. Contextual determinants, how to evaluate things that could make or break an intervention in terms of its implementation or sustainment. The kind of things that you do to install or sustain that intervention. We call them implementation and sustainment strategies. And then lastly, how do you measure outcomes? And included outcomes are equity, in that there's an equitable chance that people both receive and deliver the intervention in question. So we developed a tool called the DIRC SS, Dissemination and Implementation Research Capability Self-Survey, which is really designed for research teams to self-evaluate the degree to which these five components have been attended to, explained, addressed, even develop methods to address within the context of their research program. So this could be something people do in the planning stage. This could be something people do kind of in the self-evaluation stage. And you'll hear of an example where we're actually working with projects that have already been funded and have already started and are considering kind of pivoting in the direction to increase sort of the analysis or the methods of implementation in their existing projects. So it's a tool meant to be practical. We've used it in CTSAs, and we are using it within the context of other projects, but in particular within the HEAL HD2A initiative, which I'll talk about briefly. So the DIRC SS is really a 15-item, 5-dimension measure. It's team-based self-assessment. Ratings go on a 5-point scale from no consideration of an implementation aspect to a full, comprehensive, and complete rating. It kind of looks like this. It's a kind of an interactive PDF. We also have a version that's a Qualtrics version. This is an example of the evidence for the intervention, which we call evidentiary support. We've actually been actively using it within the context of the HEAL Data to Action program. We've used the DIRC SS. We have a pair of experts, implementation experts, actually review the application, meet with the research team. We also ask the research team to complete the DIRC SS independent of the expert dyad. And we sit down after both sets of ratings have been derived and talk about what kind of things that can be done to possibly improve the potential implementation angle of the project. And it's really shared decision making. I think sometimes these things have budget implications. Most of the times they don't. And it's really a matter of focusing on what are the goals of the project and what are the interests of the team and kind of what is doable. But we've actually found in these conversations with these 10 very different research projects and the leadership, the PIs, MPIs of these projects, to be super receptive of these conversations and actually excited by some of the opportunities they have at leveraging implementation methods and measures. So this is really just a confirmation that we use the kappa coefficient to kind of examine the inter-rater agreement between the expert dyads and the teams. It started off low. It grew. It grew from a 0.12 to a 0.41, which is from kind of none to slight agreement to moderate agreement. We show here that there again the 5 areas: evidence, partner engagement, contextual determinants, implementation strategies, implementation outcomes. We see that there's growth, improvement across all areas, in addition to the convergence in ratings by both sets of raters. And we also note that there's significant change over time in reasonably large effect sizes in the kind of the DIRC SS rating scale scores. So we really think that this is a useful tool. It's free. You'll find out during the course of this presentation and certainly at the end how you might obtain it and how you might use it. And then we're happy to talk with anyone at any time about what you discover. And I'm going to turn it over next to Dr. Powell, who is going to talk about the partner engagement tool. And then we're going to do a little bit of a relay from Dr. Powell to Alain Chakran-Garneau, and then to Ryan Garner, and then to Will Becker. So Dr. Powell, take it from here.
I'm ready. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm on the East Coast, so I'll just say good afternoon. It's 2:20 p.m. where I am. So first of all, I'd like to just thank and acknowledge all the folks who helped create the toolkit that I'll share and I'll discuss. So you see me, but I am just one of several faces who spent months working on our engagement toolkit. All right, so first I'd like to, just level set us. So when we say partner engagement, we think about partners as to refer to people, organizations, and communities that are affected by research. So this could include patients, families, treatment and other organizations, communities, state and federal agencies, payers, and policymakers. So we really think broadly about who a partner could be. And for us, this is important because a primary goal of D&I research should be to achieve broad and sustainable use of evidence-based programs and policies. And so we believe that this requires inclusivity and shared ownership and buy-in from a range of those partners and community members. So why, right? Like, why does this even matter to anybody but us? Well, we really think this is like an important approach to developing interventions that are effective across diverse groups and contexts. We can be in our labs, we can do it ourselves, but why, right? We really want to make sure that we are involving and inviting the participation of those who will be affected by research. And so this is a crucial phase, and it's necessary really for us to be able to improve health and the well-being of those who are especially affected by substance use and pain disorders, which is the focus of this research that we're working on. And the last point that I have on the slide, poor partner engagement can negatively impact intervention outcomes and foster distrust among affected groups. If people feel like they're not included or they've been forgotten, we may not even know that those are some of the effects that are happening. They have nothing to do with the actual intervention, but all about how we've interacted with people. So we are clearly not the first people to be thinking about this. And so there's a lot of work that's been done by our partners at our colleagues at PCORI, like the ORCA also, and even internationally. So we're not the first people to think about this. But one of the things that the 2 gaps that we recognize in embarking on this work was that, first of all, the core principles and practices for researchers typically they didn't necessarily focus on addiction, pain, and dissemination, right? So we have all the tools, and there's a lot out there, right? So if you've done any of this work, you know that you can throw a pen and find an article about engagement. And so what we really wanted to do is try to do the legwork for researchers and create a practical and accessible tool for folks to just be able to pick up and start somewhere, right? And we believe that this is especially important for people who are working with underserved or underrepresented communities in any way, right? Like however folks are defining that. And so what we hope to do in our partner engagement guide, and I'll go over that in a bit, was to provide some recommendations on how to identify and then meaningfully engage partners, right? And we were really, really cognizant of the idea that we wanted to meet people where they were, right? So there, like if you go to the website and see our guide, like there are things that very new people can learn, and also folks who are seasoned in the field can also use it. So we wanted this guide to be able to help people improve the quality of their research, but then also increase empowerment among the communities with whom they partner. So what do we do, right? So we spent a lot of time together talking through things. We had group meetings. We had work outside of the meetings. We had small group meetings, really trying to figure out, like, bring our collective experiences together to be able to create a document that others can use and pick up and feel like, oh, hey, I can make it with some support. So, where do we land? Start with the beginning and start from the end and go backwards. So we, again, wanted this to be an accessible guide. So right off the bat, we were like, okay, this cannot be long. If it's going to be accessible, like people can read articles if they want to read through pages and pages of materials. And so we're like, all right, if we whittled down to the core pieces of what we would want people to learn about community engagement, what would we want them to know? And so we organized it into 3 sections. So first, we start with some core principles to ground everybody in the process. And then we go through the partnering process, which is a 7 steps that we felt like were essentially important. And then finally, we close with some case studies and worksheets so that, again, if people can pick it up and see, this is what it looks like in practice. This is how people can use this. And we were very intentional about including case studies that were different, right? So different ways of engaging, different timelines of engaging partners, because we wanted to, again, show folks that there's no one right way to be able to do this. So we start with 7 core principles, and you should just like hang on to the number 7 because we like that a lot, and that's the rest that this kind of goes through the rest of the guide. So 7 core principles, and these principles were developed from, like, we scoured the literature, like all of the articles. This is something that the experts on this team had a lot of knowledge about, and so we were like, all right. We started with maybe a list of like 24 or 25. I'm like, okay, again, accessible, brief. How do we want to make sure, how can we combine what we know exists in these 24 or 25 down to a smaller list that really gets at the point? And here's where we landed. So this idea of co-learning and co-production, this is exactly what it sounds like, right? Like there's no, like everyone is an expert, not just the folks with PhDs, but also the folks who don't have PhDs, but have lived experiences. And it follows from that equity. So making sure everybody's getting what they need and being able to communicate and be compensated for those things. Humility, relationship building, resource sharing, action and change, and sustainment. And sustainment is a big deal, right? Because we all, many of us like are in the grant game and the rat race. And so sometimes it's 5 years or 3 years, and then we have to move on. But really, like, we wanted to make sure that we included that principle, because that is the spirit of this design, or being able to partner means like long term. It doesn't mean that we have a grant and then we're done. It's like we're when the grant is done, we're thinking of other ways to perhaps partner. So the next part of the guide is divided into a 7-step partnering process. And so you'll see the graphic that we broke the process down into 3 areas. 1, planning the engagement, putting the efforts to practice, because people need to know the nuts and bolts. And then finally, promoting evaluation and dissemination. So in the first phase, planning the engagement, we thought that there were two steps. First, we need to identify and secure support for partner engagement. And this meant on both sides. Yes, within our institutions, but also outside of our institutions. And in each one of the steps, I should have said, included potential pitfalls, right? This by no means goes in a straight line. If you've done this in any bit, any small part, you know that it does not go in a straight line. And so again, we wanted to make sure first, like you need to make sure that there's support all around it within your team, within your organization, but then also within your partner's organization. And then the second was to develop a partner engagement strategy. And this really is to figure out like, what's the why, the who, like who do you want to engage? Why? When does it make sense? At what phase? Like what's the best way to do it? And so we talk through, we have a worksheet about those questions for people to fill out as they are thinking about engaging partners. And so the second step is about the actual partner process. All right. So what do you do? Right? Like you've planned, you have your support, and now you're ready. And so first of all, it's important to identify levels of engagement. And we believe, I should say, all of these should be, once there is a partner at the table, these should be discussed and with the partner, right? Like these should not be decisions that investigators are making alone. So identify levels of engagement, and that could be dependent on what is needed, but also there's the time that people have to commit to the project, because it's important for us to recognize that research is our main job and not everybody else's main job. And then select methods of engagement. We provide a lot of different ways in which that could be, both in person and virtual and qualitative and quantitative. So lots of phases, lots of ways there. And then finally, like engaging in the research process. So really, what does it look like to have a partner collecting data or analyzing data or helping with the dissemination process? So thinking about what that might look like and what kind of leadership and coaching might be needed for both sides of the partnership. And then finally, it's not enough just to do it, right? Like I think that this isn't a point that even I have sometimes like failed to do as well as I hope to. And the last two steps are really to think about the evaluation. So, and this is different, not that just the outcomes of the actual study, but like really evaluating the outcomes of the partnership. So how, and we introduce and we share some ways that can be done, like the types of activities, how people felt, having interviews with both sets of partners, and then sharing it. For dissemination, right? Like, so it's great now in the world to see a lot of articles that just talk about the partnership, not necessarily the outcomes, because I think when we focus too much on the outcomes, we may miss the time and attention and resources that were needed to be able to make the outcomes possible. And that's particularly true when we're talking about partner engagement. So once we go through the partnering process, we provide two case studies. And these two case studies, we're really excited that they were actually, they were shared by members of our team. So I just want to shout out Dr. Jessica Magiston from University of Maryland in Baltimore, and then also Jesselie Husley from Addiction Policy Forum. And so they shared their stories and in about two specific partnerships that they had. Again, like I said, there are different levels with different types of organization. And so really that we wanted them, the second case study that's there, it was reproduced from a series about what keeps you up at night, right? So like really thinking about how we do this well and how we are making sure we're honoring both the research process, our partners, and ourselves. And of course, like just having the tools there weren't enough. And so we wanted to make sure that there were resources at the end. So we include like links to trainings and articles, but then also, like I mentioned earlier, just some worksheets. So again, trying to take the legwork out of it, like just having like a worksheet or almost like a Mad Lib, right? Like, okay, you like fill in the blanks and to just help the process and move along. All right. And so what's the, why? What's our why? What was our why? And so we really wanted to make sure that we could create a tool that would help researchers improve, again, the quality of their research by promoting partner engagement with communities. And that, again, partners, as I mentioned, that's a broad range. It could be people with lived experience. It could be providers of people. But it really does matter having the voice of other people who just know differently than we already know. And then we hope that by engaging communities, again, especially those have been historically included, we believe that it's important to be able to translate the research that we're learning, and for it to be useful and trusted when there are people on our teams who have been affected, and are much more, sometimes more credible messengers than we are. And then finally, like the idea of ending addiction to substances and managing pain and reducing overdose deaths, it's going to take everybody. It's an all hands on deck situation. So for us to only rely on the knowledge that we have or the networks that we have, we're really missing a large bucket of people who could be supporting these efforts and who are also impacted by these efforts. So I think that, again, as we move forward and trying to meaningfully engage partners, this is one way, or this toolkit as a way to help people to be able to do that in a high quality, equitable, and sustainable way. And I will turn it over to Elaine.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. So now we're going to segue into understanding the context in which interventions are implemented. So in other words, what factors tend to shape the implementation process and sustainment? So this work was a collaboration between a stellar group of people. They're listed here on this slide. I'm not going to go through each and one of them due to time constraints, but I did want to mention that the group was co-led by Dr. Cecilia Calhoun from Yale University. So contextual determinants are factors that affect the implementation and sustainment of evidence-based practice and innovative solutions. They're often referred to as barriers and facilitators, and they are multi-leveled and dynamic, meaning that they can be found at different levels of an organization, so ranging from leadership to patients. And they change over time. And as you affect change for one contextual determinant, there's another, it triggers a downstream effect towards others. So why does context matter? Context matters because it shapes the implementation of an intervention, and it guides the selection of the implementation strategies to successfully reach adoption, maintenance, and sustainability. And so a lot of work has been done, right, around contextual determinants. There are some very well-established, well-known frameworks that exist. For example, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, the Theoretical Domains Framework, or PRISM, just to name a few. And these frameworks are great. They're a great starting point to start understanding, right, what may need to be considered when we implement a new intervention or an evidence-based intervention. However, these frameworks and tools are really complex to use for non-researchers. It's hard to communicate. They're often, a lot of jargon is often used. It's hard to make sure that everybody is talking about the same thing when we use, complicated constructs. And moreover, the data is difficult to harmonize, and it limits cross-study comparability, reproducibility, and pooled findings. So we are not able to generalize findings or our efforts that stem from the work from these frameworks. The purpose was to develop a pragmatic, user-friendly guide which identifies contextual determinants that influence the implementation of a chosen intervention. And so we've created this qualitative, semi-structured qualitative interview guide. And the purpose of this guide was really for it to be easy to utilize both by researchers and also by practitioners. We identified a team of experts. I've shared who they are with you a little earlier. We had a co-chair leadership. The group met and we established some guiding principles, which I'll share in just a minute. And we kind of set off in small group to do some asynchronous work. And brought back the small group work to the larger group and had discussions, right, about were these questions, was this format really what we were hoping to achieve and accomplish? And more importantly, would it be useful to non-researchers and researchers alike? So the priorities of the work group was that the guide would be fluid and non-prescriptive. We did not want to determine what would matter to those using the guide. We really wanted to kind of be a ground up process. It needed to be pragmatic and user friendly. It needed to be relevant to a broad range of audiences. It should capture context at multiple levels while considering equity and an understanding of how contextual factors may influence each other. And so we landed on a semi-structured, self-administered or group-based interview guide. Probes are organized around common domains of major frameworks, so they're multi-leveled, with an equity-focused lens. In a nutshell, those are the questions that are in the guide. And then the guide obviously goes through in much more details and probes at all the levels I mentioned. So we ask about challenges or barriers, both in terms of getting the intervention implemented, but also delivered as intended. And then we ask the same question about facilitators, so things that may help the intervention being implemented or delivered as intended, the ways the barriers and facilitators are connected, and what equity, what is being implemented in an equitable fashion means to a group. And then the disparities that already exist within an organization or a service delivery system, and how a group wants them to be bridged or addressed. Qualitative findings, though informative and rich, do suffer in comparability across studies. So it really limits our ability to generalize, as I alluded to earlier. And the additional challenge with qualitative findings is that they are not easy to synthesize, and they're not really well suited to rapidly evaluate change over time. And so with that in mind, we also developed a quantitative instrument of context. And which is called the Inventory of Factors Affecting Successful Implementation and Sustainment, or IFASIS. And really the IFASIS is a pragmatic, low-cost method of identifying contextual determinants, their changes over time, but also their importance to an organization. The IFASIS can characterize any context or innovation endeavor. It has been found to have acceptable psychometric properties and practical utility. It is useful for both researchers and community partners. It allows for pooling data across projects that could accelerate generalizable finding. It's 27 items long. It's team completed. It covers 4 domains and 13 subscales, and those domains and subscales have been drawn from established frameworks such as CFR, Parrish. And there's 2 scales. There's one scale that evaluates the status of an item, and I'll give an example in just a minute, and a scale of importance, right? So if, for instance, organization identifies, financing as an issue, right? Then they are also able to quantify how much of an issue that is in their implementation process. And that is important because that also can help identify where to focus efforts, right? Which priorities, which barriers or facilitators should be targeted first. The consensus needs to be reached for scoring, so as a team, and we can derive total and subscale scores, and it takes about 30 to 45 minutes to administer, so it's not too burdensome. And so this is a snapshot of a domain, and we see that the subscale of external policies and community support. And so as you can see, for example, for item 1.1.1, it assesses leadership support, and the answers range from non-existent to strong. And then we can rate also the importance, and the instrument flags whether it's a barrier or a facilitator. The neat piece about this instrument is also the fact that we can generate visualizations, and we can also generate visualizations over time. So on the left-hand side, the one that has the red and blue columns, this is a change in barriers and facilitators, and also their importance from the initial assessment, so a baseline, over a 6 months period. And the arrows indicate the change, the direction of the change. And on the right-hand side, we see answers or how the emphasis was able to capture contextual determinants over 1 year period. And so what are the impacts and implications? So this guide and measure can allow for easy and holistic assessment of determinants and their interconnectedness. It focuses on equity, and it can help guide the selection of implementation strategy. So, you know, with the information gathered, both from the interview guide and the emphasis, or either or, we are really able to lay down a roadmap for implementation strategies and implementation efforts. And so now I will turn it over to Dr. Brian Gardner. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helene. Hi, everyone. Brian Gardner here, and it's my pleasure to present on how to document strategies that support implementation of effective interventions. Like the others, we have a large cast of characters who have helped in developing this. I'll just give everybody a moment to see the crew. So what are implementation strategies? This is often described as the stuff that we do to help the people do the thing. The thing is the evidence-based intervention. The strategies are the stuff. It's the methods or techniques that we use to enhance the adoption, the implementation, and the sustainment of clinical programs or practice. And there are a couple of compilations of different strategies that are out there. So why would you want to track implementation strategies? Well, there's a number of reasons. First and foremost, I think, is to allow other researchers to replicate the results of a study. This is an issue in the field, a replication crisis is it called sometimes. And so being able to be better at documenting the strategies that are used as part of implementation research is really critical for that. So what happened, to get these interventions used in the sites? The other is even more important, perhaps, is to translate the interventions into practices, which is where we want these interventions to end up eventually, and much sooner than 17 years. So it helps to figure out what are the steps that are needed to embed an effective intervention in a real-world setting. And then also to analyze intervention effects. Did differences in the implementation strategies affect differences in intervention outcomes across sites or samples? So why is this tool needed? Because there are tracking methods out there, but it's complicated to do some of them, and we're trying to make one a little bit more pragmatic. A colleague of mine, Alicia Bunger at The Ohio State University, has developed a method. There are a few others that you can see, including the one on the end, the Longitudinal Implementation Strategy Tracking System, or LIST. But again, the simpler we can try to make this, the more Duplo-like pragmatic tool, one that doesn't rely on D&I experts as many of the others do, one that is flexible and modifiable based on the level of specificity needed, and could be easy for research staff to use. So the methods that we did were similar to what other work groups did. We identified the team of experts that we showed on the initial slide. We met regularly with Dr. Gotham and I facilitating each of the meetings. We sought feedback from the research collaborators, even did a survey of us to try to prioritize which components needed to be tracked, and did some pilot testing with research collaborators. So what we ended up deriving was the STAR log, the strategies timeline, activities, and resources. This provides a simplified, centralized method for research teams to track the implementation strategies that they are using and testing. It can be used as part of the planning process or in the reporting, so you can use it at any time in your project. It can be completed and or updated on a cadence that makes sense for you. They need to be mutually exclusive time periods, but if you do it monthly, quarterly, whatever works best for your team, it has that flexibility built in. So this is a screenshot of it. There's going to be a second one too, but just to walk people through it, we did try to make sure that the terminology used on here is simple and accessible, even though it does kind of map to some more of the implementation science jargon in the background for implementation science researchers who also want to use it. But you include the strategy start date and end date. We do have an option for categorizing it according to some of the existing compilations of groupings, and even naming it with the those compilations. But then it gets into trying to specify, what did you do? Why did you do it? Who delivered the strategy, which would be equivalent to the actor in some of the more implementation science jargon. How many people delivered the strategy? And on average, how long did it take to prepare and deliver the strategy? Additional columns here are going to include who received the strategy, which sometimes is referred to as the action targets. How many of them were that received the strategy? And on average, what frequency did that strategy occur? On average, how long was each occurrence? And what resources or materials were used to deliver the strategy? That column there is, I think, really important, because part of the issue with replication or use in practice is that the resources for these strategies aren't readily made available. And so this emphasizes that. And lastly, because there are adaptations that are made over time, a column is included for whether the strategy was planned or unplanned. In addition to the star log, which is what a log is, something that on some kind of regular cadence is being completed, it can get rather lengthy depending on how long the project goes. And so we also created a complement to it, which is called the star table. It also refers to the strategies, timeline, activities, and resources, but it really is a summation of the star log. It could also be used, though, for some preliminary planning to try to sketch out what it is that you are wanting to deliver. Timeline is emphasized as the first column. It maps to what is called temporality and some of the other strategy specification guidelines. And here it's really, because sequence can matter, it's really laying out which strategy is being delivered first and second and third and fourth. And if you have a rollout design, which many implementation studies have to do, where they can't provide the strategies to all sites at once, you can also include the different rollouts. In terms of the activities, what you see in the middle part, we have all of, but except for one of the Proctor recommendations where we don't have rationale, and here we could have used that as the R, but we think that's probably better served for a protocol paper. But what we do have is you're naming the strategy, you're identifying the activity target, who is this for, and then just a general description, kind of a brief definition of it. Then we've incorporated the concept of function and form, sort of the justification, why the activity's purpose, why would you want to do this? Who are the, what are the targeted implementation outcomes or client outcomes that you're doing? What is the purpose of doing this? And while it could have the same function for a strategy, it can come in lots of different forms. And so here it's where a more precise description of the activity is provided, and also indicating who is the one delivering the strategy, who is the actor in more implementation science jargon. And then lastly, the resources. You can see here we have listed in this example a number of different resources that are needed for each of these strategies, whether it be a manual, a workbook, a training, a platform, a guide, or a tracker. And these could be hyperlinked to appendices in a results paper. So the impact and implications. How can the star log be used? Well, it can be used to outline resources and costs needed while planning a study. Can be used to replicate interventions in research studies or real-world settings, help track adaptations in the implementation strategies used, facilitate cost-effectiveness analyses that are important for sharing with policymakers and government officials, and can help harmonize information across studies and meta-analyses or other reviews. And with that, thank everyone, and we'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Becker.
Thank you, Dr. Garner. I think I'm the last of the didactic sections. I'm going to try to pick up a little speed here. I'm going to talk to folks about integrating implementation outcomes into effectiveness studies. So I will pause for a moment to let you all see who was involved in this work group, a really great group of collaborators who I think produced a really helpful user's guide that I will talk about in more detail. So implementation outcomes measure how much and how well an intervention was implemented. And this graphic on the right kind of gives you a sense of how it fits into the other pieces of what some have labeled the implementation research logic model that my colleagues have discussed today. Popular frameworks for measuring implementation outcomes include the Proctor framework, which we'll go into more detail about, and the REAIM framework, which I know many are familiar with. The implementation outcomes that Proctor et al. Elaborated on in 2011 are sort of the foundation of our work group's product. And I'm going to walk through them one by one quickly. First is acceptability, and that's the extent to which the intervention is considered suitable, agreeable, and satisfactory. Second, appropriateness, perceived fit of the intervention for a practice setting. Adoption, decision by an organization or provider to take on or deliver an intervention. Feasibility, extent to which the intervention can be successfully used in a given setting. Fidelity, the degree to which the intervention is implemented as the protocol prescribes. Cost, and that is, of course, the financial cost of delivering the intervention. Penetration, degree of use of the intervention within the population of organizations, providers, and clients. And then finally, sustainability, the extent to which a newly implemented intervention is maintained within an organization's ongoing operations. Why would an effectiveness researcher embed implementation outcome measures in their study? Well, a lot of useful reasons. First of all, it would help one clarify reasons for the intervention's success or failure, would address variability across contexts, across unique sites and diverse patient groups, accelerating the research to practice translation, which is a common theme across all our presentations today. It would help inform how to tailor implementation strategies, assisting in long-term planning, and finally aiding in understanding impact in real-world settings. So why this specific guide that we created? And that is, we thought there were several lists or repositories of outcome measures, but no guide per se, why, when, and how to use them. So we wanted to create a practical user's guide of sorts, and our guide uniquely includes case studies that demonstrate practical applications. So we offered definitions of the outcomes that one might use. We supplied tools for how to select outcomes. We provided case studies, as I mentioned, and we really sought to bridge the gap between research and routine practice. So our methods were much the same as the prior presenters. We had an interdisciplinary collaborative group, formed a work group that included experts in D&I science, opioid use disorder, pain management. We defined our implementation outcomes of interest using the Proctor et al. Framework that I mentioned. Selection criteria, we came to consensus on criteria for selecting implementation outcomes based on study context and targeted population of interest, and iterated on decision criteria for each outcome. And then finally, we used real-world examples from published studies to demonstrate application of the methods. This is our user's guide, and I will believe have a link to it in my last slide. So here's an example of an implementation outcome from our user's guide, and that is acceptability. Why measure acceptability? Well, it would gauge the likelihood of recruitment and retention success, can help you understand why organization leaders, providers, or clients are or are not willing to participate in the intervention. Also helps you interpret study results. As I mentioned before, providers are more likely to implement the intervention and clients more likely to engage in it if they find it acceptable. And high or low acceptability can help interpret effectiveness study results. For example, low acceptability might help explain results showing that the intervention did not have the intended effects on client outcomes. And then it helps for assessing potential for adoption in routine settings. High acceptability of the intervention makes it more likely to be adopted later or in routine practice settings. Moving on in terms of the acceptability outcome. So who do we want to learn about acceptability from? Leaders of organizations delivering the intervention? Yes. Providers delivering the intervention? Well, that depends. If study staff, hired staff as part of the research project are delivering the intervention, probably don't want to measure acceptability because they're just following a protocol. But if it's real world providers delivering the intervention in routine practice settings, absolutely want to assess acceptability. Clients participating in the intervention, yes, of course. When to assess acceptability, pre-intervention rollout, definitely, and then also consider doing it at the end of the study, understanding organization leaders, providers, and clients' perceptions of acceptability at the end of the study to help interpret study findings. So how to measure acceptability? We offer examples. So this could be done in qualitative or survey measures. One simple qualitative interview item: would you recommend this intervention to your family or friends? And then why not? That sort of really gets to the essence of what acceptability is. And then for some survey examples, we give a link to a repository that folks can peruse for publicly available survey instruments. So again, on acceptability as our example, we talk about key considerations, measuring both acceptability of the implementation strategies as distinct from acceptability of the intervention / evidence-based practice itself. And we can say that low acceptability of the intervention increases the likelihood of ad lib intervention modification. So if study interventionists don't find it acceptable, they're more likely to deviate from the protocol. So good to know that up front. And then we provide acceptability examples for how it has been incorporated into real world studies, as shown here in this example. The impact and implications: we really think that thinking intentionally and proactively about implementation outcomes improves implementation quality, encourages sustainable practices, and we hope that our user's guide will help reduce research to practice gap, shortening that 17-year time between discovery and practical application. And I think we have here the link that was also put in the chat by Sonia, where you can access all the products we talked about on today's webinar using this QR code or the link listed here. And finally, references for our presentation.
Well, thanks, Will. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Ellen. And thanks, Terry. And really thanks to the audience for sticking with us. I sort of realize an hour and a half is a pretty long time to sort of muscle through a webinar. We're grateful for you riding the distance with us. And hopefully, I think there are two things that come to mind. One, it's our intention that these tools and guides and resources were simple, a la Duplo-esque, and we think our experience in sharing them with research teams and actually improvement specialists has been really positive. I think what we've noticed is that once they take them out of the box, they can actually use them and play with them and benefit from them. There may be a couple of exceptions, though. I think the exceptions might be the emphasis that Alen talked about, the inventory of factors affecting implementation and sustainment. It looks like there needs to be a little bit of consultation on how best to use that. So I know Alen is readily available, and we have team members who are readily available to do that. And then the star log that Brian talked about, I think it also seems from user feedback to require a little bit of kind of instruction, but not overly complicated. So hopefully you didn't hear too much of the theory, model, and framework business that we really try to avoid, because we've heard from everyone that that's not really helpful. So we want to try to back out of that. So I think we've got two questions, and I guess I would encourage anyone who's still with us to type questions in the chat. This is our first time doing a Heal Connections presentation, so we're not exactly sure of the protocol, but it looks like the first question see if I can find it. Has to do with the pace of implementation. Why does it take so long? It's a great question, 17 years. And you think about, in the case of things that are effective, delaying access to something that might be life-saving and certainly beneficial. And so I do know that the current, there's a Dissemination and Implementation in Health Academy Health Conference in DC in a couple of weeks. If you don't know about it, let us know and we can get you the information. I don't think it's too late to show up and register, although obviously advanced registration is not possible. And if you happen to be in the DC area or the tri-state area, it might be something you think about. December 9th through 11th. And the topic of the conference is the pace of implementation. So there'll be a lot of presentations on and focus on how to speed that up. But I guess I want to jump, maybe to do a jump ball to the team here to see if folks have thoughts about why it does take so long.
I'll go ahead and jump in. Thanks, Mark. I mean, it's I think there's a number of reasons. I do think that, part of it is the research process of multiple years to do a grant, and sometimes I'm going slower than expected. So that if you develop a intervention in an efficacy trial, that's going to take 5 years. Then you do the effectiveness research, that's 5 years. Then you do the implementation research, that's 5 years. I mean, that's 15 if you best case scenario. So 17 wouldn't sound so bad. But that's the big part of it is that it just it's going through those hurdles. And that's why I knew what I was going to say. That's why hybrid trials, ones that can try to speed up the process by simultaneously doing some effectiveness research and implementation research, could significantly reduce the length of time that it takes to get out there. So I think there are some solutions that are realistically being applied.
Yeah, I would just chime in to say I think sometimes the bottleneck can be with decision makers who sometimes may be a little bit short-sighted, if you will, about how an intervention might actually impact the long-term health of their clients. And I think increasingly, well, I don't know about increasingly, but sometimes there's a short-sighted, especially financial, what is the return on investment of this intervention in too near of a term, and instead of thinking about what's the return on investment over a longer span. And I think when organizations can think about a longer span of health, they may be better positioned to see the value of specific interventions. So this return on investment issue, I think, can stymie the uptake of promising practices.
Yeah, I was thinking that each of the presenters addressed one of the a major reason why it does take so long, and Terry talked about partner engagement, and if you think about if the end users, the partners were involved earlier on, maybe you wouldn't have had so much trouble later on getting them to accept it or adopt it or think about using it. So I think that partner engagement from the beginning throughout is really critical. And I also think Alain's presentation on considering aspects of context as early on as possible is one way to accelerate the implementation, adoption, and sustainment. And likewise, knowing what those barriers are, what Brian talked about in terms of the strategies to deal with them, using an implementation logic model, for instance, kind of matching strategies to barriers would accelerate things. And then lastly, just really paying attention as you go along, measuring outcomes. So I think some of what we're proposing is probably designed to accelerate the ultimate translation into the real world. But there's a lot of bureaucracy involved in this too, when you think about the FDA or other government agencies whose mission is to protect and kind of consumer oriented. So there's reasons for regulations, but my sense is that there's tremendous bureaucratic bottlenecks And I think that pertains to the second question. See if I can find it, which really has to do, and I'm going to interpret a little bit here, that it has to do with what does a person do who's kind of outside, kind of the systems of research enterprise at universities that has kind of a potentially effective clinical innovation, intervention, and how does, what's fair for a person operating outside of the usual channels. And that's a bit of a stumper for me. I live and work in Silicon Valley and am approached constantly by people who have brilliant ideas that are really kind of catchy and attractive, but I think about all the things that could do harm with those ideas, and may not ultimately work at the end of it all. But I guess I defer to my colleagues too. What are your thoughts about getting something through the systems without kind of the support of an academic research enterprise?
I'll maybe take a stab, and this may be related to a later question about just partnering. I think my answer to everything is probably to partner, right? So for those who are outside of the research space or writing the grants, a lot of times it just takes proof of concept, right? And so if you are in an organization or whatever space you're in, with even if it's like, practice, having some evaluation data, like you need to be able to show that this is helping someone. And then also figuring out like, all right, I think part of the reason that it has worked partnering with researchers at all, right, is to say, like, we know a lot of measures, we know like what people are looking for. And so part of what we wanted to do, even with our toolkits, is try to take some of the legwork out of it, right? So I think sometimes people, I will always quote a thing that someone said to me once before: we need to be careful about confusing the gap in our knowledge with the gap in the field. So like, just because like, you're like, I've not seen it, it's like so new and innovative, it could already exist, right? And so I think one of the advantages of partnering is, one, you're able to get a pulse on like whether or not there's something like this already. And then two, you're able to gather some evaluation data to be able to say like, we have proof of concept here. There's a there. And with a little bit more time and with a little bit more money, we might be able to go there. And I don't know, like I'm in a department where NIH is not the primary resource. Like we go to NSF, we go to MCH Bureau. So I don't think you should assume that NIH or the federal funds are the only places. There philanthropic organizations, foundations that also may be willing to take a bigger risk than sometimes NIH may be. And so I would suggest those things. Those are some of the things I would suggest.
It's a great suggestion. There was a quick question about how a person could access expertise on their grant applications, and it looks like Alen responded to that. One of our centers, the CDIA Center, has a online portal, and people can make requests and get the time and expertise of a kind of a deep roster, a deep bench of experts to consult on an application, or even, if it makes sense to join the application as the implementation expert. So we've had pretty good success on that. And I know people at different institutions experience a little bit of bottleneck on that issue, but for the most part, I think there's expertise available, if not at your own institution, at the center that we have here. Looks like Annalie had a question.
Yeah, I think we addressed that one, Mark. I mean, Helene said she could contact her, and I put in 2 teaching resources, Jeff Curran's Implementation Science Made Too Simple, and then Sarah's D&I Bridge. They're both kind of framed as teaching tools.
Yeah, we've noticed increasingly kind of a proliferation of dissemination and implementation science centers and institutes. I sort of thought we were onto it early, but now we look around and they're all over the place. So there's a part of me that thinks, well, what's happening? And then there's another part of me that thinks this is fantastic, that this is great, that people are getting this knowledge and technical skill closer to home, oftentimes free, and really thinking through about how to optimize their work. Because most people do care about public health impact. And I think that there may be a really small circle of people who are interested in effect sizes and publications and more grants only. But I don't think that's generally true about all of us who are doing work in the field of addiction and pain. Cynthia has a question about could you put how to reach partners and experts in HEAL in the chat, that we have the contact page if we want to partner on SUD RCTs. Yeah, I think, Alen, maybe you could help with that. The Research Adoption Support Center is focused on support of projects within the HD2A, but creating tools that go well beyond everything HD2A. So through HEAL, the Research Adoption Support Center, and all of these products are examples of things that anyone outside of HD2A or inside of HD2A can use. And then anything that has to do with substance use disorder, RCTs, I think Alen is the co-director of the CDS, the Dartmouth Center, or the Dartmouth Center, the Stanford, I need lunch, specific time here, the Stanford Center and Dissemination and Implementation. So I think that's probably a good resource. And also, Cynthia, we have a special interest group with the NIDA CTN on translation and implementation, and there's a lot of interest in how to leverage implementation science methods within the context of clinical trials. So that might be, if you're not connected with one of the CTN nodes, but more kind of out in the field, that's possibly a group that you could think about joining. It meets bi-monthly. Question 4. Does anyone, maybe Terry, have any insights into the challenge of partner engagement when it takes so long to get interventions in place? Yeah, I think you sort of commented on this earlier, Terry.
I was writing a very long response, and that's just how long it's been. So maybe I'll just say the thing. 2 bits, Heather, that I would offer. One, transparency. Like, it goes a long way. Like, I think sometimes we're like, we don't want to burden our partners with the problems. No, like, share the problems, be upfront about the timelines. In any new partnership that I'm forming, I make a literal timeline. So it could be like, if we're in November 2024, I'm like, and then in November 2026, right? Like, so really being upfront about the timeline, about sometimes how slow like the grant making process is, or the writing, so that people know, right, that they're not expecting a tomorrow you will have $500,000, right? So, and similarly, when there are hangups in projects, being clear about that, right? So, I mean, one that we often encounter, as much as I would think we resolved this, is payment, right? Like the hoops that sometimes our partners have to go through to get paid, and like the legal jargon. And so really being, I mean, I have a whole 1-pager now about, all right, here are the steps you need to take. Here's when you should expect it. And if you don't, let me know, because that means I need to send off 8 emails to figure out where payment is and where it got stuck and whose desk it's on. So so that would be the first thing. Transparency, like, really makes people feel like they're a part of the process and not on the outside looking in. And then the second thing is, I'd say just having always like I used to say bag of tricks. I think the better way to say it is a menu of options, right? A menu of options of ways that you're partnering, right? So this has happened to me. Sometimes our data collection is stuck in IRB. It's just stuck there. We're going back and forth with like little things. And so when my partners have already been on board, I'm like, hey, it's stuck. But let's be ready. Like, let's like meet and talk about like the people, the people and places we'd like to talk to when we are ready. So we're going to make our recruitment list, or we're going to make sure we're review the protocols to make sure everybody's clear on it. So hangups happen, right? Like, things take much more time than we want them to. So I found just having like a range of things for people to do so they don't feel like they're twiddling their thumbs is a good way to approach it. So those are the 2 bits of information, the 2 bits of advice that I'd be able to offer in those situations.
I think we're ready to move on. I really appreciate folks that have stayed with us for the whole 90 minutes.
Thank you
No,
so much to our presenters, and thank you to everyone for joining us for the Heal Connection sharing session. Please take the survey that you see on your screen right now. You can scan that QR code. There'll also be a link in the chat. And your feedback can help us design, contribute to, and improve our programming. So we really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much, and we will be following up with slides and other materials in a couple weeks.